Hello folks, it's Dave back again. This time we're going to take a look at trying to describe the challenges that we're dealing with in a software engineering project. So this is the motivation for the course, if you like. What are the issues that we have to deal with, the problems that we have to solve if we're going to start working on much larger and larger pieces of software? So today I want to introduce all the problems, and then over the course of the term we'll see what we can do about trying to solve some of them. So once again, first off, I'm just going to drop the talking head in the corner there. So again, in your first year, first couple of courses, the programming exercises are pretty small scale. We assume that you don't have much of a programming background. We assume that you've got sort of limited experience. So everything is done in short time frames where we're usually focused on learning a particular language feature or learning a particular syntax example or learning how to do something like work with an abstract data type. So there's these very small chunks that you're dealing with, and conceptually the problems themselves are pretty limited. So I guess the other side of that is there's usually a fairly clear goal. We want you to build this, and we try and be pretty explicit about what it is we want you to try and create. And it's rarely the case that you later have to go back and take the code that you wrote for that and heavily modify it or use it as the basis for something else. Once in a while, but it's not usually the primary focus. So you don't usually have to clean up the messes that you left in old code. So if you did happen to mess up, it's not a big deal, right? We throw that code out and go ahead and work on something else. Of course, that's not the case in larger real-life software projects. So what we want to look at now is this whole issue of scaling up. Bigger problems, longer time frames, bigger groups. So say you're developing a large application or a game or something where you're going to have a huge team of people involved. It's either going to be months or years in development, and then presumably it's going to be in use for years after that, and it's got to be maintained over that time period. So there's a huge collection of issues that come up around this. How do you go about figuring out what you're going to create and what all the different pieces are and how they have to fit together? How do you design your solution? How do you actually build it? How do you manage the project as it's running around? As it's running along? How do you keep everybody organized and on the same page? How do you handle the financial side of things? How do you make sure that everybody's got the necessary knowledge that you need to build this thing? What training is involved? So there's all sorts of different issues that start cropping up as we move into bigger and bigger scales. So this little ugly graphic here is focused on just some of the people that might be involved in a big project. So I believe this one was focused more or less on the thought that we're looking at a game, but lots of the same roles apply in almost any project that we're working on. So you've got a huge chunk of people who are working on the content, the graphics, the sound, the audio, the visual, localization, making sure that it's translated correctly for all the different regions where it's going to be used. You've got all sorts of people doing the writing behind it. If we're talking about a game, you've got the sort of story design and level design going on. You've got all sorts of work in trying to figure out what it is you're going to create in the first place, figuring out what the requirements are, what do you need, breaking that down into some kind of a logical model so we can describe it and visualize it. Maybe putting together some basic quick prototypes in the beginning so people can actually play with what it's going to look like and see if it seems practical or not. You've got the actual design where you're figuring out what the user interface is going to look like, what kind of help and guidance people should have, what the graphics are going to look like, is there an AI component, what kind of testing do we have to do to make sure it works, how do we make sure that this works nicely with all the different networking issues that are going to crop up, locally and remotely. There's actual use of an engine, again, if we're thinking of this in a game perspective. What do we need in terms of data storage and databases and cloud and who knows what else? What kinds of tools and editors do we have to create or use or support? All sorts of things that go into figuring out how we're actually going to build this thing. And again, we've got a huge team of people involved in all sorts of different pieces. You've got the rollout to think about. How are you going to distribute it to your clients, to your end users? How is it going to be installed? Do you have server-side installs, client-side installs? What's going on? What has to happen in terms of configuration? As time goes on, you're going to have to maintain it. Right? There's going to be patches, client-side, server-side. There's going to be mods and customization that people are going to want to be able to do. So there's all sorts of things that are going to happen from the technical standpoint in how we build this. And as that's going on, you've also got people that are trying to actually manage the project itself. If you've got teams of 20, 50, 100, 1,000 people working on this particular project, then there's also an awful lot of administration that goes on. So you've got things like the project proposals where we're trying to figure out what it is we're going to build and getting approval and buy-in on that, right? Making sure that people are actually on the same page about what it is we want to try and go ahead and build. Again, if we're going to spend 2 years on this, somewhere at the beginning we have to go through and describe, okay, well, here's where I see things going. And that's going to be just an initial vision. And it's going to change a lot, and it's going to be expanded a lot as time goes on. Maybe a feasibility analysis. Is this practical? Is this something that we're going to be able to make money with? Team roles, organization. How do we structure all of these different people that are involved? How do we get them into groups, into teams that function effectively, communicate effectively? Risk management. What do we worry about in terms of what can go wrong? Technically, organizationally. What if the world shuts down due to a pandemic? What kind of risks are we going to focus on and plan for, and what kind of steps can we take to minimize the damage if problem X crops up? Issues in terms of recruitment and training. Right? This is a very fluid field. People tend to change jobs quite frequently, and they're looking to upgrade their skills and move on to bigger and better things as time goes on. So you're constantly looking at the problem of recruiting new people for your project, getting them brought up to speed, training them in new areas that you need. As the project rolls along, you're going to be going on and saying, okay, well, we need to, at certain points, stop and assess how things are going. Once we think we've got the design more or less in place, we're going to want to stop and review that and say, okay, does this look like a good design? And so you usually have some fairly formal points where you're going to pause and reflect on what you've got and do a review and decide what needs to change before you roll forward. Back in terms of the financial side of things, the timing side of things, you've got to plan out, well, when do we think this thing is going to be ready? And how much is this going to cost? And as time goes on, you're saying, okay, well, our new cost estimate, I know we said it was going to cost $1 million, but now we think it's going to cost $3 million, right? So you've got this constant budgeting process where you're looking at how much time and energy has gone into it so far and how much there is still to go. There's an issue in terms of planning out the development life cycle that we're going to follow. How are we going to actually structure all of these different steps together? What kind of phases are we going to go through? How are we going to assess where we are in building our project? How are we going to keep it organized as it rolls along? So we'll spend a fair bit of time talking about development life cycles pretty soon, actually. Task planning, figuring out all the different things that we have to do and mapping them all out. We can't do X until we've done Y, and we can't do Y until we've done Z, and figuring out how long each is going to take and building up this big dependency chain so that we don't go trundling along in the project and suddenly hit a point where everybody's stuck for 2 weeks because there's some crucial step that hasn't been done yet. So there is a lot in terms of the management side of things. I guess just the regular old people management side too. Right? You're going to have all sorts of people issues, people arguing, people quitting, people disagreeing about how things should be done. There are going to be human issues that you have to deal with, and vacations and illnesses and all sorts of other wonderful things. And then in terms of the actual production side as well. We're looking at, well, how do we get the money for this to build it, right? How do we pay for this project as it's going on? Do we have intellectual property issues? Do we want non-disclosure agreements for the staff so that they don't take, our brilliant new design and jump to somebody else and use it there instead? Licensing issues, marketing issues, distribution, quality assurance, reviews. There's all sorts of things that are going on in a big project that all have to be coordinated as this runs along. So these are some of the things that I want you to start thinking about whenever you're looking at a software project, when you're looking at a game or a tool or anything that you're using or interested in. Start looking at, well, what did it take to build that? How big a team did it involve? What kind of technologies were involved? How long did it take them? What did it cost them? What kind of issues did they run into? And just start thinking about these things, because they're all issues that you're going to run into over the course of time as well. So, looking in terms of individual teams, we've got challenges within a team itself, right? We have to make sure that when we're working on a piece of the project, everybody's got the same understanding of what it is we're creating. And across teams, that works as well, right? If we look back at this giant chart of people, we have to make sure that the content providers have the same view of the thing that we're building as the people who are doing the coding. And we want to make sure that they have the same view of what it is we're creating as the people who are doing the advertising and all of the different marketing approaches. So we're trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page about exactly what it is we're creating, what our priorities are, what our schedule is, what our budget is, right? Trying to make sure everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing in this greater project, and to make sure that their part is ready on time and works with everything else. And again, making sure everybody's on time, making sure everybody's on budget, or at least making sure that if somebody's over budget or behind schedule, that other people know about it so that we can adapt the rest of the planning process for it. Again, finding and training the people that we need, dealing with the people management issues. There's all sorts of things that are going to crop up as we're working on these larger projects. Then there's a number of issues in terms of just what it is we're trying to create. Right? When we're going through and we decide we're going to build a new product or create a new product, we have to figure out what it really is. Right? It's not enough to just have this sort of back of the envelope idea that, oh, I'm going to create this new game that's killing zombies or whatever it's going to be. You need to make sure that we've got all of the relevant people involved in the decision-making process, in the designing process, and making sure that they are all on the same page. Right? So you want to make sure that you've got some kind of involvement on the part of the people who are going to be using whatever it is. You need to make sure that you've got the agreement of the people who are going to be paying for it, right? Whoever's doing the financing for this. And you need to make sure that the people who are going to do the creation, right, all of those creative steps, to make sure they're also on the same page and they're also supportive of what it is you're trying to do. Right? So you have to make sure that everybody's got this same view of what it is we're creating, what kind of a timeline we're working on, what kind of a budget we're working on, and who's doing what. And a big part of that is communication, right? Making sure that we've got sufficient involvement of all the different people. They're talking to each other. We're documenting what's going on. We're making notes about what decisions have been made. We're trying to clearly lay out what this is going to look like, what it's going to do, when the different pieces are going to be ready, who's doing it. And somehow all of this information has to be clear and complete, understandable, unambiguous to all these different groups of people. So you're trying to write this so that the people who are doing the artwork and people who are doing the animation and people who are doing the sound effects and people who are doing the documentation and manuals, so that everybody's got the same view of what it is we're creating. If all of these different people come from very different backgrounds, and So you have to make sure that when you're writing this, you're writing in a way that isn't targeted to just one audience. If you're a developer, when you're looking at documentation, you've got your own focus, but you have to be aware that other people with a different focus might also be using these same documents. So we need to make sure that all these different groups actually go through the documentation to make sure that they all think it's correct, right? When the people doing the audiovisual material go through it, they're going to be looking for different things, and they're going to spot different errors and different issues than, again, the developers are going to, and they're going to spot different issues than the management people are going to. So you're trying to make sure that everybody's going through all this, everybody understands it, and everybody's in agreement. And of course, as the team gets bigger and bigger and bigger, as your staff gets larger and larger and larger, it gets more and more challenging to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then if this is something that goes on for a couple of years, decisions are going to change, thoughts are going to change, ideas are going to change. You're going to need to keep the documentation up to date. You're going to need to change that so that if I go and look at the planning document, I know that it's talking about the current plan and not some plan that we threw out 6 months ago. So all sorts of communication issues. And again, we're trying to keep in mind that people's perspectives are different. Somebody who's doing the story writing for something is going to have a different viewpoint than somebody who's developing the network code for it. And they're going to have a different viewpoint than somebody who's designing the artwork. And they're going to have a different viewpoint than somebody who's going to be running the helplines for this. And so everybody's going to have a different perspective. They're going to have different perspectives than the person who's footing the bill for all this and is expecting to make a profit. They're going to have a different viewpoint from the person who's doing the marketing for it and who is thinking of, okay, well, how can we get the most buy-in from the most people? Right? So everybody comes at something from a different perspective, and you have to keep that in the back of your mind all the way through your project. Right? Keep in mind that the way you're looking at something isn't necessarily the way everybody else on the project is looking at it. Then we get into the technical challenges. And a lot of this is what we're going to focus on as sort of individual pieces of this particular course, where we're dealing with the actual nuts and bolts development issues that we have to face. Suppose we've got to support multiple different platforms. We're trying to support Mac and Windows and Android and Linux and who knows what else. We've got multiple different languages that people are using. We've got multiple different currencies. We've got sites all around the world. We've got a whole bunch of different versions of the software. We've got a trial version. We've got a free basic version. We've got an enterprise version. We've got a personal version. We've got, version 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3 and 2.1 and whatever else. And in a big project, there might be hundreds or thousands of different files that are involved in all of this, right? Files that have got different chunks of code in them, files that have got different chunks of data in them and different chunks of configuration information in them, all sorts of different things. And we're trying to make sure that we're keeping all of these hundreds or thousands of files up to date for all of the different platforms, for all of the different languages, for all of the different currencies and sites and all of the different software versions we're supporting. So there are some huge issues in terms of configuration management and version control. How do we keep all of this organized? So this is one of the things that we'll take a look at actually fairly early in the course, where we get into version control. Again, how do we track that we've got the right version of the right file in the right language, in the right place for the right platform? Then we also have to worry about how we're going to test to make sure that all these pieces are correct as we're building them. Right? We're not going to have this whole thing all ready all at once in one magical moment. We're going to be developing a little piece here, a little piece there, a little piece here, a little piece there. And we don't want to run into a scenario where at the end we put all the pieces together and it doesn't work. So we want to be able to have a mechanism for testing the individual pieces as we're developing them, to make sure that, okay, this piece is okay, this piece is okay, this piece is okay, these two pieces together are okay, these three pieces together are okay, and eventually building them all together into a valid working whole. So again, one of the things that we're going to focus on in this course is going through the development and testing process, and we're going to take a look at some test automation as much as possible so that we can see if we've got a lot of testing work to do and there's a lot of tests that we want to run over and over and over again. Every time we modify something, we want to make sure we test it to make sure it still works. So we'll take a look at the test automation and test development process as a big chunk of this course. Bug tracking, bug fixing. If we've got something that's going to be running for years, we're going to have, and if it's a complex product, we are going to have bugs. We are going to have issues. And as time goes on, and as other software that we interact with changes, and as different pieces of the software change, we're going to have more bugs that crop up over time and more issues that crop up over time. So we want to be able to keep track of what are the issues that exist right now, who's working on them, what kind of a decision-making process do we have for deciding when to fix something and when not to, who's going to pay for it. All of that kind of thing has to be tracked as well. So lots of technical challenges that we'll try and look at over the course of the term. So again, in this course, we're going to try and go through and address bits and pieces of all of the different problems that I've talked about today. So we'll look at writing specifications for the software, describing what it is we want to create, following some basic software development processes, so we've got some kind of a structured approach to building what it is we're going to create. The use of scripting languages to automate some of the common tasks. So if there's something that I'm doing over and over and over again, I want to try and automate it if I can so that we don't have human error creeping in, typos, and forgetting to do steps. We want to make sure we take a look at the effective use of things like debugging tools and code profilers, right? Things that help us write better software. Automation of testing, developing test plans, applying test plans, following good design principles. We'll take a look at code standards and documentation standards to try and ensure that we're producing a higher quality product. We'll take a little bit of a look at creating effective user interfaces. Most of that's going to be saved for courses like 310. We'll look at code maintenance issues. We'll look at localization issues, right? Developing something that's going to work across the world for all sorts of different languages and all sorts of different scenarios. And we'll take a bit of a look at deployment issues, update issues, patching, and rolling out a product. So lots of things that we'll try and discuss. For most of it, we're going to get kind of a short intro to it, and courses further down the road will expand on this in a lot more detail. But hopefully by the end of this course, you've seen what some of the problems are, and you're able to plot out a reasonable approach to how to develop good software in larger projects in a team setting. So there's the plan. We'll see how we go as the term rolls along.